In a small town in an old kingdom, there is a duty that has been performed by one woman of the town in every generation for as long as the town has stood. The duty has a name. It is called asterisk the reading asterisk. The woman who performs it is called asterisk the reader asterisk. The town is small, perhaps 300 households. It sits on a slow grey river in the lower country, where the hills are gentle and the fields are good, and the road from the south runs through it without slowing. Most travellers passing through the town do not notice the town. There is an inn and a small market on the third day of every week, and a church of grey stone with a single bell that has cracked once in the last 100 years and been recast, and now rings, in the careful judgment of the older people of the town, slightly too sharp. There is a small mill on the river. There is a tannery on the southern edge that everyone agrees should have been built somewhere else, but that has been there long enough now that no one any longer talks of moving it. There are the houses, and the gardens behind the houses, and the dovecotes, and the old stone wall that runs along the river bank, and the small cobbled square outside the church where the market meets. The town does not, in any way that a passing traveller would notice, keep secrets. But it does. It keeps one. In the small house at the end of the lane that runs west from the market square, there lives, in every generation, the reader. Her house is small and grey and quiet. The shutters are usually closed. The lamp inside is usually lit, even in the day, because the reader's work, the small careful work she does at a wooden table by the south window, is work that requires good light. Her name is known to the town, but her work is not spoken of openly. Children of the town are taught, when they are very small, to walk past the reader's house quietly, to not knock at the door unless their mother has sent them, to not, under any circumstances, peer through the window. When a person of the town receives a letter from outside the kingdom, they take the letter to the reader. This is the duty in its simple description. The deeper description is harder to give, because the deeper description requires the listener to understand what asterisk outside the kingdom asterisk means in the way the people of this town mean it. The kingdom is small. It has roads that go to other kingdoms, and ships that go to other lands, and travellers who come and go, and ordinary letters that arrive in ordinary canvas mailbags, and are sorted in the small post office at the centre of the town, and delivered by an ordinary man with an ordinary canvas satchel to the houses of the people they are meant for. Those letters are not the kind the reader reads. Those letters are read by the people who receive them the way letters have always been read. But sometimes a letter arrives that is not from any of the places the kingdom knows about. Such letters arrive in particular ways. They are sealed with a wax that is not the wax of any sealmaker the kingdom has ever recorded. The wax is black and very smooth, and it does not crack when the letter is bent the way ordinary wax cracks. The seal pressed into the wax is a shape that none of the heraldic books of the kingdom have ever recorded. The paper of the letter is heavier than the paper made by any mill in the kingdom, and it has a faint smell, described by those who have held such letters as the smell of a small dim room that has been closed for a long time, with something in it that was once alive, but is no longer. The ink the letter is written in is black, but it is not the black of the inks made in the kingdom. It is a different black. It is, the older people of the town say, the black of looking down a deep well. These letters come to the town perhaps 4 or 5 times a year, sometimes more, sometimes none in a year, and sometimes 9 in a single autumn. There is no rhythm. The letters do not, in any pattern that the town has been able to identify across the long generations, follow any rule. When such a letter comes, the person it is addressed to does not open it. The person it is addressed to puts on a coat and walks down the lane to the small grey house at the end of the western lane and knocks at the door of the reader and waits. The reader takes the letter. The reader sits at a wooden table by the south window and lights her lamp if it is not already lit, and she opens the letter with the small ivory-handled knife that she keeps for that purpose. She reads the letter. She does not, while she reads, allow the person who brought the letter to see the page. The page is for her eyes only. The reader is the only person in the kingdom who is permitted to see what is written on such pages, and what is written on such pages is the only thing in the kingdom that the reader is required to keep entirely to herself. When she has finished reading, the reader tells the person who brought the letter what they need to know. Sometimes this is a few sentences, sometimes it is one word, sometimes it is a long, careful explanation that takes the better part of an hour, and that the reader gives in a quiet, steady voice while she holds the letter face down on the table between them. The reader gives the person what the person needs to know. She does not give them more than they need to know. The reader then folds the letter and places it in a small wooden box that sits on a shelf above the table and closes the box. The person leaves. The duty is done. This is the work, and it has been done in this town for many generations, and the town has agreed, without ever having needed to say so, that this is how it must be. This is the story of Mara Wenn, who was the reader of the small town from the autumn of her 32nd year until the spring of her 73rd year, and who served the duty, in the slow, patient way the duty must be served, for 41 years. She was named to the duty by the woman who had been reader before her, an old woman named Sale Brassic, who had been the reader for 37 years before Mara took her place, and who had been named to the duty by the woman before her, who had been the reader for 29 years, and so on backwards through the long line of readers that the small town had had since the small town had begun. Mara had not known, when she was a child, that she would become the reader. The reader, in the way the town's tradition worked, was always named in adulthood. The reader chose her successor when she felt herself growing old, or when something in the work began to tell her that the time was approaching, and the choice was made privately, and the chosen woman was visited at her own house, and the duty was offered. The chosen woman could refuse. Most did not refuse. A few, in the long history of the town, had, and the reader had then named another, and the duty had passed in the new direction. But the offer was, when it came, generally accepted. The town's families understood, in the way the town's families understood many small old things, that to refuse the duty was a kind of refusal that was felt by the town for a long time afterward. Mara had been 32 years old when Sale Brassic came to her door. It had been a warm afternoon in the autumn of that year. Mara had been weeding the small vegetable garden behind her house. She lived alone, in a small cottage on the river road, in a house she had inherited from her mother, who had inherited it from her grandmother. Mara had not married. She had not, in her young womanhood, met any man she had wished to marry, and she had not, in her later womanhood, regretted the not marrying. She lived quietly. She kept her garden. She helped, in the small ways the town's unmarried women helped, with the running of the church and the keeping of the parish records, and the small services that the town required of women who were free of the duties of a household. She read books. She had in her small house a collection of perhaps 30 books, most of them inherited from her grandmother, who had been an unusual woman, the daughter of a schoolmaster, and she read them slowly and reread them, and they were her chief pleasure. She had been weeding the garden on that warm September afternoon when Sale Brassic had come up the river road and stood at the gate of Mara's house and called her name. Mara had known, when she heard her name called, who was calling her. The voice of Sale Brassic was a voice that everyone in the town knew. Sale had been the reader since before Mara had been born. She was perhaps 70 years old by then. She lived in the small grey house at the end of the western lane, with her shutters mostly closed, and she walked through the town occasionally on the small, ordinary errands of an old woman, and she was a familiar figure to everyone, and she was also, in some way that no one openly discussed, a figure slightly different from everyone else. The children of the town walked past her quietly. The adults of the town greeted her with a respect that they did not give to other old women. When she was in the church on Sunday, the people sitting near her in the pews were a little more careful with their hands and their feet than they would have been near anyone else. Mara had risen from her weeding. She had wiped her hands on her apron. She had gone to the gate. Sale Brassic had looked at her for a long moment. Then she had said in her clear, quiet voice, "Mara Wenn, may I come in for a small while?" Mara had said yes. They had sat in Mara's small kitchen at the wooden table by the window. Mara had made tea, the small careful service of a woman who has had unexpected company, and Sale had drunk her tea in slow, patient sips, with both hands on the cup, the way old women sometimes do. The conversation had not begun with the duty. The conversation had begun with the harvest, and with Mara's garden, and with the parish records, which Mara had been helping to keep that summer. Sale had asked careful, ordinary questions. Mara had answered carefully. The conversation had gone on for perhaps half an hour in this way, and Mara had begun to understand that Sale was watching her, in the small private way old women sometimes watch younger women, and that the watching had a purpose. Then Sale had set down her cup, and had said, in the same clear, quiet voice, "Mara, I have come to ask you whether you would be willing to take up the work that I have been doing for these 37 years. Mara had not, immediately, understood what was being asked. She had looked at Sale across the table. Sale had said, "I am the reader of this town. You know this. The work is well. The work is what you have heard of in the small ways the town speaks of it. I am old now. The work has been wearing on me in the small ways such work wears for some years. I have been thinking for the past 2 years about who should come after me. I have been watching in the way the work has taught me to watch. I have been considering you." Mara had been silent for a long moment. She had said, finally, "Why me?" Sale had smiled. It was a small, slow smile, with something of pity in it and something of recognition. She had said, "Because you live alone, Mara. Because you have read books your whole life and have learned to keep what is in books to yourself. Because you have a kind of quietness that the work requires. Because the family you come from has always been known to be close-mouthed about the things the family has known. Because when I have spoken your name to myself in the small private way the work has of testing names, the work has not spoken back against you." She had said, "I am not asking you to decide today. The duty is not light. You should think on it. I will come back in 7 days. If your answer is yes, I will begin to teach you. If your answer is no, I will not press you, and I will look elsewhere, and we will not speak of this again." Then she had finished her tea, and risen and gone. Mara had sat at the wooden table for a long time after Sale had left. She had not gone back to the garden. She had not done any of the other small things she had planned for the afternoon. She had sat at the table, with her cup in front of her, and she had thought. She had known, in some small private way, that she would say yes. She had known it before Sale had finished speaking. She had known it in the way one knows certain things, the way one knows on a cold morning that one will eventually get out of bed, even though one has not yet decided to. The duty had been offered to her. She would accept it. The reasons for accepting it were not, she understood, reasons she had any need to articulate clearly to herself. The acceptance was older than reasons. When Sale had returned, 7 days later, Mara had said yes. The teaching had taken the rest of that autumn and all of the following winter. Sale had come to Mara's small kitchen 3 afternoons a week and had taught Mara what the duty required. The teaching had been strange. It had not been the kind of teaching that is done with books. It had been done in conversation, slowly, in the way old women teach younger women particular things, with long pauses and small particular details, and the slow accumulation of a kind of knowledge that cannot be set down on paper. Sale had taught Mara what the letters looked like. She had described the wax, and the smell of the paper, and the color of the ink. She had shown Mara, once, only once, in the privacy of Sale's own small grey house at the end of the western lane, an actual letter, a letter that had come perhaps 2 months earlier. Mara had held the letter for a few moments, in her hands, on the small wooden table by Sale's south window. The letter had been cool to the touch. The wax of the seal had been smooth in a way that wax should not be smooth. The smell of the paper had been the smell Sale had described, a small dim room that had been closed for a long time, with something in it that had once been alive but was no longer. Mara had said, after she had held the letter for a few moments, that she understood now what Sale had meant about the smell. Sale had nodded. She had said, "Yes, that is the smell. You will know it always after this. Every letter has it. The smell does not fade with the age of the letter, does not fade if you put the letter in a box. It does not fade if you put the letter in a drawer. The smell is something the letter has, and something the letter keeps having. Mara had given the letter back. Sale had put it in the small wooden box on the shelf above the table. That was the only letter Sale had ever shown her before her training was complete. The reading of the letters, Sale had explained, was something Mara would learn to do only when the duty had passed to her. Sale could not, even in teaching, read a letter aloud to Mara. Sale could not, even in teaching, allow Mara to see the words on the page. The words on the page were for the reader's eyes only, and Sale was still the reader, and Mara was not yet, and that was how the duty worked. What Sale could teach, in the long autumn and winter of Mara's training, was everything around the reading. How to receive the letter from the person who brought it, the small careful greetings and the small careful seating arrangements, the way the lamp was to be set, the angle the letter was to be held at while it was read, the way to fold the letter when the reading was finished, the way to place it in the box on the shelf, the way to speak to the person who had brought it, the careful, slow speaking that gave the person what they needed to know without giving them more than that. Sale had taught Mara, in detail, the small particular phrases that the readers had used across many generations for telling people what was in their letters. There were perhaps 24 such phrases. They were not, Sale had said, the only phrases a reader could use, but they were the phrases that the readers had learned over the long years were most often the right phrases. Mara had learned them. She had practiced them in the small private way Sale had instructed her to practice, saying them aloud, at her own kitchen table, in the empty house, in the slow, careful tone the readers used. Sale had taught her, also, the small precautions. The fact that the lamp by which the letters were read had to be lit with a particular flint kept on a particular shelf. The fact that the room in which the letters were read had to face south. The fact that, when a letter was being read, no one else could be in the house, not even on the floor below or in another room. The fact that the small ivory-handled knife that the reader used to open the letters had to be kept in a particular drawer, wrapped in a particular cloth, and that the cloth had to be the same cloth that had wrapped the knife since the knife had first been given to a reader many generations before. The fact that the small wooden box on the shelf above the table was never to be moved from that shelf. The fact that the box, when full, was to be exchanged for a new box. Sale had a small store of such boxes in a cupboard, and the boxes were all alike, and the old boxes, when they were full, were taken to a particular place on the river bank at a particular time of year, and were buried, with a small ceremony, in the way the readers had always buried them. There were perhaps 100 such small precautions. Mara had learned them slowly over the long teaching. She had asked Sale once about the most important question, the question of what to do when a letter was *bad*. Sale had been silent for a moment. Then she had said, "Most letters are not bad, Mara. Most letters are simply letters. The work is mostly the reading of letters that are not bad letters that say small things or careful things or things that are difficult but that are not, in any final sense, *bad*. You will read such letters for many years. You will become accustomed to them," she had said. But sometimes a letter is bad. Bad means a letter that contains something that the person who has brought the letter cannot be told, something that would harm them or that they could not bear or that they have no right to know. When such a letter comes, and you will know it when it comes, because the work teaches you to know, you do not tell the person what is in it. You tell them, instead, the words I will teach you, which are the words the readers have used in such cases for many generations. The words say only that the letter has come, and that you have read it, and that there is nothing in it that the person needs to act upon, and that they may go home. The person will know, when you say these words, that the letter was bad. They will not ask you what was in it. The town has agreed, since long before either of us was born, that this is the way. Mara had asked what happened to the bad letters after they were read. Sale had said, "They go in the box like the others. They are buried like the others. They are not in any final sense different from the others. They are simply letters. Some letters you can tell, some letters you cannot. The work is to know which is which and to do what each requires." She had said, You will, in your years as the reader, read perhaps 1,000 letters. Of those, perhaps 50 will be bad. The rest will be ordinary in the way these letters are ordinary. Do not, when you begin, expect every letter to be bad. Most are not. Most are only the small particular communications of a world that is in correspondence with our world for reasons of its own. And that has not, in any of the time we have been receiving its letters, given us any cause to believe that those reasons are themselves bad. Mara had asked one final question. She had asked, very quietly, what the world on the other side of the letters was. Sale had been silent for a long time. She had said, finally, I do not know, Mara. I have been the reader for 37 years, and I have read perhaps 800 letters, and I do not know. The letters do not, generally, describe themselves. They are letters about other things. They are letters from people, or from things that are like people, who are writing to other people, or other things that are like people in our town. The relationships are old. They go back many generations on both sides. The reader is, in some way, the keeper of the relationships. But what the world on the other side is, that is a question that the work does not answer. The work is the keeping of the relationships. It is not the understanding of them. You will, after a long time, become at peace with this. I have. Then she had finished her tea and gone home, and the next afternoon she had come back, and the teaching had continued. The teaching had ended on the morning of the spring equinox. Of the year, Mara was 33. Sale had come to Mara's house on that morning, and had given her the small ivory-handled knife wrapped in its particular cloth, and the small store of wooden boxes, and the flint, and the lamp. The same lamp the readers had been using for many generations, a small heavy lamp of dark grey iron with a single careful wick. And she had given Mara also the small leather book in which the readers had kept their records. Then she had taken her own things from the small grey house at the end of the western lane, and had moved to the small back room of the inn, where she had lived for the remainder of her life, which was 4 more years. And Mara had moved into the small grey house at the end of the western lane, with her lamp and her knife and her boxes and her flint and her book, and she had become the reader. The first letter had come 3 weeks after she had moved into the house. It had been brought to her by a man named Tom Hares, who was the baker's youngest son, 26 years old, and who had come up the lane in the late afternoon with his cap in his hand and the letter in his other hand, looking like a man who had been told what he was supposed to do but who had not, until that moment, fully understood what it meant. Mara had taken the letter from him. She had felt, for the first time since she had held the letter at Sale's table, the cool of the wax, and the heaviness of the paper, and the small particular weight of a thing that did not entirely belong in this world. She had brought Tom into the small front room and seated him at the wooden table by the south window, and lit the lamp with the flint, and had taken the letter to the table opposite him, and had used the small ivory-handled knife to break the seal. She had read the letter. It had been, as Sale had told her most of the letters would be, an ordinary letter. The kind of ordinary that these letters were. It had been a small private message about a small private matter that Tom Hares had been waiting, in some quiet way of his own that he had not entirely admitted to anyone for many years. It had been a kindness, in the small way these letters could be kindnesses. It had told him, in the careful black ink and the heavy paper and the smell of a closed room, that the person he had been thinking about was well, and that the person sent her regards, and that the person hoped Tom was also well, and that the small particular matter the letter was about was settled, and that Tom should not, in any of the years still ahead of him, worry about it any longer. Mara had read the letter through twice. She had folded it. She had told Tom what he needed to know, in the careful, slow words she had practiced at her empty kitchen table for so many afternoons. Tom had sat very still while she spoke. When she finished, he had been crying quietly, in the small way grown men sometimes cry when they receive news they have been afraid to receive for a long time, and the news, at last, is good. He had not said anything for a moment. Then he had thanked her. He had stood. He had taken his cap. He had gone home. Mara had placed the letter in the small wooden box on the shelf above the table. She had sat at the table for a long time afterward. She had understood in those long minutes of sitting what the duty was. The duty was not the reading of the letters. The duty was the carrying. The reader carried, alone, the knowledge of what was on the other side of the letters, and the reader gave to each person who came to her only what they needed of that knowledge, and the reader did not, in any of the years of her service, give the knowledge to anyone else, or share its weight, or speak of it. The reader carried it. That was the duty. She would carry it. She understood, for as long as she was the reader. She did. She read perhaps 900 letters in the 41 years of her service. She read them in the small grey house at the end of the western lane, by the light of the heavy iron lamp with the single careful wick, at the wooden table by the south window, with the small ivory-handled knife wrapped in its particular cloth in its particular drawer. She told the people who brought the letters what they needed to know. She did not tell them more. Of the 900 or so letters she read, perhaps 48 were bad asterisk, in the way Sale had described, letters that contained things the recipients could not be told, and that Mara therefore did not tell them. For those 48, she said the words Sale had taught her, the old words the readers had used for many generations, and the recipients had heard the words, and had known what the words meant, and had thanked her, and had gone home, and had not asked what had been in the letters. She put the bad letters in the box with the others. She buried the boxes, when they were full, at the particular place on the river bank, at the particular time of year, with the small ceremony she had learned. She kept the book. Of the 900 letters, she remembered, in her later years, a small handful with particular clearness. There had been a letter, in her 7th year as the reader, brought to her by a woman named Geraint Howell. Geraint was, at the time the letter came, perhaps 50 years old. She had buried her husband 2 summers before, after a long illness, and had not, in the years since, been entirely well in her spirits. She had come up the lane on a cold afternoon in February, with the letter in her hands, and her hands had been shaking. She had not, when Mara had taken the letter from her, said anything at all. She had only sat at the table and waited. The letter, when Mara had read it, had been from her dead husband. It had not been written by him in the world Mara knew about. It had been written by him from somewhere else, somewhere that the letters came from, in the careful black ink, and on the heavy paper that the letters were written on, and it had been a small, simple message. The kind of message a man might leave for his wife if he had been called away on an unexpected journey and had had only a few minutes to write before he left. He said he was well. He said the place he was in was, and here the letter used a word Mara did not know, but that the context made clear was a word for asterisk acceptable asterisk adequate asterisk not bad asterisk. He said he thought of her. He said she should not, in any of the years still ahead of her, blame herself for any of the small things she had blamed herself for. He said he hoped she would, in time, marry again if a kind man came, and that he would not, in any sense she should worry about mind. He said he wished her well. He said he wished her well 3 times, in 3 different ways, the way a man does when he is trying to make sure a thing is heard. Mara had read the letter twice. She had folded it. She had told Geraint, in the slow, careful words, the small particular things in the letter that Geraint needed to hear. Geraint had cried, quietly, in the way she had not, perhaps, allowed herself to cry in any of the months since her husband's burial. She had thanked Mara. She had gone home. She had, in the years that followed, become slowly better in her spirits, and had eventually, when Mara was in her 10th year as the reader, married a kind widower from the next village over. Mara had attended the wedding, in the way a reader could attend the small public events of the town. She had seen Geraint laugh at the wedding, in a way Geraint had not laughed in the years before the letter. Mara had not said to anyone that the laughter was related to the letter. The reader did not say such things. The reader carried them. There had been a letter in her 16th year that had been the worst letter she had ever read. It had been brought to her by a young man named Callum Tarn, who was perhaps 20 at the time, and who was a quiet, thoughtful boy whom Mara had known since he was a child. The letter, when Mara had read it, had been bad asterisk in the way Sale had described, bad in the deepest way the bad letters could be bad. It had contained, in the careful black ink, a thing about Callum's family that Callum could not be told, and that no one could be told, and that Mara had wished, while she read it, that she could unknow. She had folded the letter. She had, in the slow, careful way, said to Callum the old words the readers used for the bad letters. She had said them as gently as she could. Callum had heard them. He had understood, in the way the recipients always understood. He had thanked her in a voice that was quiet but not broken, and had gone home. He had lived a long, ordinary life after that, had married, had had children, had become, eventually, the master of his father's small mill on the river. And Mara had watched him in the long years, and had been glad, every time she saw him in the church or at the market, that the words she had said to him that afternoon had been the right words. She had carried what was in the letter for the remaining 25 years of her service. It was, she sometimes thought, the heaviest thing she carried. She did not, in those 25 years, share it with anyone. She did not, when she was teaching Hella Brennan, share it with her either, although she did, in their long conversations, describe the kind asterisk of thing such a letter could contain, in general careful terms. The specific letter, and what was in it, died with Mara. There had been a letter, in her 23rd year, that had been the strangest of the letters she ever read. It had been brought to her by a small girl of perhaps 8, named Annie's Forge, who had come up the lane with the letter in her hands, and her face very serious, in the way small children's faces sometimes get when they have been entrusted with a thing they do not entirely understand. The letter had been addressed, in the careful black ink, to asterisk the small girl who comes up the lane on the day this letter arrives asterisk. It had been written, Mara understood as she read it, for Annie's specifically. The letter had told Annie's, in the simple language a thing on the other side might use to write to a child, that she would have a long, good life, that she would do many small kindnesses for many people in the years ahead of her, that the beings on the other side had noticed her in the way they noticed certain people, and that they wished her well. It had said nothing else. It had been short. It had been signed, and the signature had been a small careful drawing of a flower that Mara did not recognize, but that Annie's had recognized when Mara had described it as the flower that had grown in the spring of the previous year on a small grave in the churchyard where Annie's grandmother was buried. Mara had told Annie's in the slow, careful words what was in the letter. Annie's had listened, with her serious child's face, and had nodded slowly, and had said thank you, in the small, careful way the children of the town had been taught to say thank you to the reader, and had gone home. She had grown up in the town. She had married, in time, a kind man. She had been, in her own quiet way, exactly the kind of person the letter had said she would be. Mara had watched her over the long years that followed, and had felt, every time she saw Annie's in the church or at the market, a small, careful gladness, in the way one feels gladness at a thing that has gone right. Of the 900 letters, those 3 had stayed with her most strongly. There had been others. There had been a letter, when she was 29, that had been from a child who had died in the town 50 years before, written to his mother, who had been an old woman by then, and who had been bedridden in her small house, and who had been brought the letter by her grown granddaughter. There had been a letter, when she was 34, that had been a small careful warning about a thing that was going to happen in the town, which had allowed the recipient, a quiet, steady man named Ewan Briss, to prepare in the small careful ways he could prepare, and which had spared him a worse outcome than the one he eventually had. There had been letters that were short, of 1 sentence only, addressed to people whom Mara had never seen come to her door before, and who had nevertheless come, because the work had a way of bringing the right people to the door at the right time. There had been letters that were long, of many pages, that took Mara most of an afternoon to read, and that contained whole conversations between the recipient and someone on the other side. There had been letters that had asked the recipient for nothing, and letters that had asked the recipient for a small, careful thing. Never anything large, never anything that could not be done, but small particular acts of kindness or attention that the recipient was free to perform or not to perform, and that the letters never followed up on regardless of which the recipient chose. There had been letters that had simply said asterisk, "We have not forgotten you asterisk and asterisk. We think of you asterisk and asterisk. Be well asterisk." There had been many of those in the long years. She also lived, in those 41 years, the rest of her life. She took her tea in the morning, in the small grey kitchen of the small grey house, with the lamp on the table even at breakfast, because she had grown to like its light. She kept her small garden behind the small grey house, a few rows of beans and onions and small careful herbs, the kinds of things an unmarried older woman keeps for her own table. The garden had been, when she had moved into the house, an overgrown patch of earth that Sale had not been keeping in her last years. Mara had cleared it in her first spring. She had planted it slowly, over several seasons, in the way one plants a garden one expects to keep for a long time. By her 10th year as the reader, the garden was a small careful thing, with 3 apple trees against the southern wall and a row of roses along the path, and a small careful patch of vegetables that she ate from for most of the spring and summer. She read, in the evenings when no letter had come, the books her grandmother had left her, and the small new books she occasionally bought from the travelling bookseller who came to the town twice a year. She walked to the church on Sundays. She helped, in the small ways the town's older women helped, with the small affairs of the town, the parish records, which she had kept as a younger woman and which she continued to help with after she became the reader. The small acts of charity that were organized from the church for the poorest families of the town, the careful tending of the graves of the older readers in the small churchyard, which Mara took on as her particular responsibility. She had friends, not many, because the duty did not encourage many friends, but a few, who knew not to ask her about her work, and who valued her for the small careful kindnesses that an unmarried older woman with no household of her own can offer to neighbours. There was Ira Thane, the schoolmaster's wife, who came to take tea with Mara once a week for 38 years, until Ira's death of pneumonia in the winter of Mara's 62nd year. There was Owain Prize, the old smith, who had been a young man when Mara had become the reader, and who had become an old man in the same town beside her, and who used to leave small careful gifts at her door in the autumns. A small wooden carving, a jar of his wife's preserves, a small pair of shoes he had made for her when her old shoes had finally worn out, one for each of 3 different decades. There was the priest, Father Brennan, a different Father Brennan in different decades, but always called Father Brennan, in the way the town's priests were always called Father Brennan after the founding priest of the parish, who came up the lane every few months to sit at her table and talk, in the slow, careful way priests and readers sometimes talked, about the small, careful matters of a town that lived alongside something that the town did not entirely understand. She grew older. Her hair, which had been dark brown when she became the reader, became grey and then white. The lines around her eyes deepened. Her hands became thinner. She kept the duty. She thought, occasionally, in the long, quiet years of her service, about the world on the other side of the letters. She did not, in those years, come any closer to understanding what that world was. She came to a kind of peace with it, in the way Sale had told her she would. She understood, after the long accumulation of letters, that the world on the other side was old and complicated, and that it had its own concerns, and that its correspondence with her town was, by the standards of the relationship she could observe, a careful and considerate one. The letters did not, generally, ask anything difficult of the recipients. The letters did not, generally, contain anything alarming. The letters contained the small particular communications of beings who, for whatever reasons of their own, kept up correspondence with the people of one small town, in one small kingdom, across a boundary that no one in either place fully understood, and who did so, on the whole, in good faith. That was Mara's understanding, after 40 years of reading. She held it lightly. She did not, in her last years, try to deepen it. She had decided, somewhere in her long service, that some understandings were sufficient at the level of feeling, and that further analysis would not improve them. When she was 72, in the autumn of her 72nd year, she began to feel what Sale had felt, the small wearing of the work, the slow accumulation of weight that was not exactly a tiredness, but that had something of tiredness in it. She had read perhaps 18 letters that year. She had handled them carefully. But the carrying, between the readings, had begun to feel, and she could not have explained this to anyone but Sale, who had been dead for 34 years. The carrying had begun to feel, in some small way, like more than she could carry alone for many more years. She thought that autumn about whom she should name. She thought, through the long winter that followed, about a small careful list of women in the town, women she had been quietly observing for many years, the way Sale had observed her. The work had taught her to watch. She had watched without meaning to for a long time. The list of names she had at the end of that winter was not long. It was 4 women, of whom 3 were passable, and 1 was the most passable. The most passable was a young woman named Hella Brennan, who was 28, who lived in a small house on the Eastern Road, who had not married, who had read a great deal in her young life, who had inherited a small careful quietness from her grandmother, and who was, in some way Mara recognized without quite knowing how, the kind of woman the work would not speak back against if Mara spoke her name aloud. In the spring of her 73rd year, on a warm afternoon in March, Mara walked to Hella Brennan's small house on the Eastern Road and stood at the gate and called her name. The conversation went, as such conversations always go, the way it had gone 41 years before, between Sale and Mara, in another small kitchen on another quiet afternoon. Hella had said yes. The teaching had begun. Mara taught Hella that spring and summer and autumn, what the work required. She taught her in the same way Sale had taught her, slowly in conversation, with long pauses and small particular details, in the slow accumulation that cannot be set down on paper. She taught her about the wax, and the smell of the paper, and the color of the ink. She taught her the small precautions. She taught her the careful phrases. She showed her once a single letter that had come during the teaching, and Hella held it for a few moments at Mara's table by the south window and gave it back, and Mara saw on Hella's face the small recognition that she herself had felt 41 years before, and she knew then that Hella would do well in the work. The teaching ended on the morning of the spring equinox of the year Mara was 73. Mara gave Hella the small ivory-handled knife wrapped in its particular cloth, and the small store of wooden boxes, and the flint, and the lamp, and the small leather book in which the readers had kept their records, and in which Mara had now kept, in her own careful hand, the records of 41 years of her own service. Then Mara took her own few things from the small grey house at the end of the western lane, and moved to the small back room of the inn, where the previous readers had also moved when their service had ended. She lived in that small back room for 3 months. She had her tea in the morning. She walked in the afternoons by the river. She thought, in the long quiet of an old woman who has set down a long duty, about her 41 years. She did not, in those 3 months, share with anyone what she had carried. The carrying ended with her. She died on a clear, cool morning in early summer of the year she was 73, of no particular illness, only the slow ending of a body that had done its work, and that was now done. She was buried in the small churchyard at the center of the town, beside her grandmother and her mother and her great-grandmother, who had been a reader in her own time, 4 generations earlier. The town buried her with the small ceremony it kept for its readers. It was a quiet ceremony. The town had agreed, since long before any of the people now living in the town had been born, that the readers were to be buried quietly, with respect, and without speeches. The readers had not asked for speeches. They had carried a long duty, and they had carried it well, and the town honored them in the way they would have wished, by saying very little about the work, and by allowing them, at the end, the privacy they had given to so many letters. Hella Brennan stood at the back of the small group of mourners. She was 30 by then, in her 2nd year as the reader. She had read perhaps 50 letters of her own. She wept quietly, in the way one weeps for a teacher one has loved, and she did not say anything to anyone. After the burial, she walked back to the small grey house at the end of the western lane, and she lit the lamp on the table by the south window, even though it was still afternoon and the light was good. And she sat, For a long time, alone, in the small front room where Mara had read so many letters, and where Sale had read so many letters before her, and where the readers before Sale had read so many letters before either of them. She has been the reader for 16 years now, at the time I am telling you this story. She has perhaps another 20 years of service ahead of her, if she lives the long lives the readers have generally lived. She has begun, in the past 2 years, to watch, quietly, in the way the work teaches women to watch, for the woman who will come after her. Somewhere in the small town, on the slow grey river in the lower country, a girl is growing up who will, perhaps 30 years from now, be the reader. She does not know this yet. Hella does not know yet for certain who she is. But the work is patient. The work has always been patient. The girl will grow. Hella will watch. The duty will pass in the way it has passed in the small grey house at the end of the western lane for as long as the small town has stood, and for as long, perhaps, as it will yet stand. The letters will continue to come. The world on the other side will continue to write to this one. The readers will continue to read, in the long, careful line of women who have, generation after generation, carried alone the knowledge of what is on the other side, and given to each person who comes to them only what each person needs. The lamp will be lit, in the small grey house at the end of the western lane, every day at dusk, and every morning at dawn, and on every afternoon when a letter has come. The duty will continue. The carrying will continue. The small, careful kindness that has, for many generations, been the work of the readers will continue. Good night.